Welcome those who are in the room already. We know sometimes that break people trickle in a little slower, but we want to definitely honor your time as we are approaching the end of our workshops. We are excited to be able to invite an outstanding individual. One of the great joys of doing the work that I do at NBA is being able to meet outstanding individuals who are doing great work in their own arena, which reminds us that we are not the only shiny tool in the toolbox. There are more individuals, and it's beautiful to know that as we work toward creating a more beloved community, the kingdom of God here on earth, expanding our social impact, that there are people who are equipped to help people in certain contexts. So this is a specific context of churches, congregations who are pivoting for impact. This will be led by Mark Sampson. This is his everyday work. So we hope that this presentation and this dialogue, and we always want to encourage, this is a moment where you actually have somebody in the room who perhaps is a wealth of information, a wealth of knowledge that could benefit you in your context. So please don't be afraid to take up space, ask questions, and engage as best you can to get what you need in order to do your work in your context. So all that said, I want to invite Mark Sampson to share more about himself if he chooses, as he engages us in the work of churches pivoting for social impact. Thanks, Mark, for being with us this morning.
Thanks, Darnell, for that wonderful introduction. I'm just going to sort of say a little bit about myself, give you a bit of context, and then I'm going to ask those of you on the call if you're happy to share your name and where you're from, and then also sort of what draws you to this sort of topic. So I'd love to hear that, and then we'll get cracking. So as you can probably tell by my accent, I am from Alabama, and no, obviously not. I'm from England, and I moved to Michigan a year and a half ago, and I'm just sort of north of Detroit in the kind of rural enclaves, I guess, around Detroit. And yeah, that's sort of two hats that I bring to this conversation today. One is that I'm the co-founder and lead learner of a small organization called Rooted Good. And we work at the kind of intersection, really, of sort of money and mission. So thinking about new economic models, but also how do we do more good in the world? And all the various things that overlap with those two sort of questions. And so I'm a sort of founder of that organization, and we're particularly running a big project right now, which I'll talk about more later, called the Oikos Project, where we're helping congregations reimagine the use of their buildings and spaces through a lens of social enterprise. So that's one of my hats. My other hat I have a kind of part-time academic hat, or cap, I guess you probably should say. Recently completed a doctorate in theology and economics, looking at social enterprise through King's College London, and that's coming out as a book later this year. And I'm really interested in both in the kind of theology and practice of this work. I'm very much a sort of reflective practitioner, I guess you could say. But yeah, really fascinated by that. But I'm excited about this conversation. I've met Darnell a few times, wonderful guy. And thanks, Anthony. Oikos is actually not with Reggie Blunt's work. He's and Sydney Williams. They're fantastic folk. And the more you can interact with those two, the better. But we actually both kind of named our projects the same thing at exactly the same time. It's quite amusing, but slightly different. But yeah, know Reggie well, and they're doing fantastic work. But yeah, I'd love to just go around and ask people to introduce their names. I'd love to hear people say their name, where they're from, and kind of what drew you to this seminar or this workshop. What kind of interests you about this topic? It's always hard to do this in online spaces because there's not like an order around us. If people want to just jump in, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.
I'll go first. Break the ice.
Thanks,
My name is Ken Gregson. I am from Bradenton, Florida, which is just south of Tampa. And two things have motivated me to come to this particular workshop. Our church is in a crux where we have to pivot, or we're not going to be in existence in a couple of years. So need to pivot from the way things have been. It drove me here when I saw the title, and bringing as many people along with that pivot as I can. The word mutuality in the title made me think about that and what's mutually benefited for the most. So that's grabbed by the title, I guess.
Thanks, Ken. Thank you. Yeah, somebody else want to say, introduce themselves?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Greetings, everyone. My name is Ramey Wood, and I'm participating here from Interior, Alaska, actually. And you'll have to allow me a brief disclosure. I have a neuroinfection that I've been dealing with for about 10 years. It causes a tremendous amount of pain. So I may have some stutters and some different neuro things. So please accept that with some patience. Thank you. I'm originally from Colorado. I've been up here since the late 90s, and I got my master's degree in the year 2000 in interdisciplinary learning master's. 10 years ago, my mother and I started an aging advocacy venture, basically because of all the gaps of that have been created as part of these conversations. So the reason that we're all here is something that I've been fortunate to, in a secular and in a spiritual and church community building, community advocacy, community services sense, I've been able to see how so many of these relationships play a part. So in a sense, this and you all are a gift, and I'm excited to learn how we can all continue to process that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Ramey. Really appreciate that. Lovely to see you, and I'd love to be in Interior, Alaska right now. That sounds wonderful. But yeah, so we're just going around introducing ourselves and where we're from and why this kind of topic or question is interesting to us. So yeah, if somebody else wants to jump in and go, that would be lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm Anthony Everett, and I am Shawnee in Cherokee land, which is now known as Lexington, Kentucky. And I'm with the United Methodist Church, an ordained elder with the United Methodist Church. I have a doctorate in ministry, and I actually teach a doctoral cohort called Prophetic Activism, from the cross to the community. And so our whole focus is on social entrepreneurship, nonprofit leadership, how the church is in those spaces as opposed to specifically just in the church. I've started a couple of nonprofits before. I currently am the executive director of Mission Behind Bars and Beyond, which is a faith-based ecumenical nonprofit based in Louisville, but it services the entire state of Kentucky, and focuses on helping returning citizens to receive their humanity. And so that's who I am.
Thank you, Dr. Anthony. That's a brilliant introduction. Thank you. Yeah, somebody else want to introduce themselves? That'd be fantastic.
Greetings. I'm Miriam Gentle, and I am in Washington State, in the south central part of the state, not the Seattle side. There is more to Washington than just Seattle. I am a pastor at a local church, a Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. And it's a small church, but it's faithful to its call. And we are trying to discern and maybe focus that call a little bit, especially in light of the pandemic and COVID. And they've stripped down everything that they could to just continue functioning. So I want to help them as they continue that journey and focus their vision statement, maybe get a mission statement out of that. But I was curious also, in your Mark, in your description of this, or the blurb that was offered to us, is like you ask what good looks like, and not everyone agrees on what that means. So I don't know if you'll address that, because I was curious about that. Boy, if we can't agree on that, then we're kind of in trouble. So thank you. I'm going to turn off my mic because it's lunchtime here, and I'll probably be eating while you talk. So sorry.
Fantastic. Eat away, Miriam. Wonderful. We got to keep the main thing here. Okay. Love it. If anyone else wants to jump in, that'd be fantastic. Okay. All right. So yeah, thank you. And yeah, really great to hear from everybody. And I'm sure we'll have people join in and sort of, you know, these are always sort of permeable spaces, these online sort of meetings, webinars. So got to go with that. This is fantastic. I'm really fascinated by lots of aspects of this conversation, you know, interested, Ken, you know, talking about the urgency behind this for you, that if your church, you know, essentially, I imagine needs to find a new economic model in the near future, and you know, otherwise there's, you know, some questions about what the sustainability of the congregation is going to be. And you know, I've interacted with that lots recently, lots of churches I've talked to and that are wrestling with it from that angle. You know, Dr. Anthony started lots of nonprofits and has, you know, got some fascinating projects right now on the go. And there's that angle as well of how do you start new things well? How do you pivot existing things? And then also, how do we find sort of better ways of just serving and loving our communities? You know, how do we find new ways to be missional in this very fast changing world that we're in? And I'm interested, obviously, we're all interested, right, in this room, in this social enterprise angle on that question. And I'm going to sort of think about that from kind of a 30,000 foot view perspective, and then dive into some of the sort of challenge of social enterprise, and then hopefully go into some of the promise of social enterprise, and then start thinking about what that might mean for sort of churches and nonprofits today. And I'd love to sort of then give some space at the end for some sort of real questions and conversations and comments from all of you, because I know all of you have an enormous amount of sort of interest and experience in these things. So, you know, it's probably not going to come as news to you that not everybody's a fan of social enterprise. Whilst around in this room, we probably are. Not everybody is, both in terms of wider society, but also in the church space as well. And I think obviously that social enterprise holds immense promise, but I also want to suggest we have to be thoughtful about this, because I think it can also at times hold some peril for us. That it's not just a band-aid solution to economic challenges or social challenges. It's not a sort of out of the box something that's going to magically change everything, but it's an invitation into what is in some ways quite a new practice, in other ways actually not very new, but it's an invitation into a practice that is contested. So the question of social enterprise is contested in our culture at some level. And I just want to briefly explore that as a way of framing this conversation together. So one way to think about this is to head straight up to sort of 30,000 foot and think, okay, what's been happening in our society that has made this phrase social enterprise become a kind of common phrase for us? I'd suggest 50 years ago, that certainly was not the case. And if you think about it, 50 years ago, our society was pretty much divided into sort of three main sections. There was the state, the private sector, and then sort of civil society. The state's leading sort of protagonist is the government. You know, that could be local government, federal government. You know, the private sector is the corporation and business enterprise. And then civil society was sort of association. So that's non-profits and charities, congregations, clubs, membership groups, and that. And these three different sections were pretty watertight sections. They were quite distinct from each other. There was a very, even legally strict separations between government and business on the one hand, particularly in the US, actually, less so in Europe, and then government and civil society on the other hand. And particularly there was a firm line between civil society and the private sector, business. And the idea really in that kind of setup of a liberal democracy was that each of these institutions existed to do different things, right? Businesses exist to create wealth, and then some of that ends up getting taxed a bit by the government. Other that through philanthropy is given into civil society. Civil society exists to kind of create that sort of social infrastructure that exists in healthy communities. And then the government, lots of theories about what the government should and shouldn't be doing. I'm not going to distract us with those, but there's a whole bunch of questions that they're different though, different roles, different responsibilities. Then in the last, particularly 30 to 40 years, the boundaries between those sectors has been dissolving at a rapid pace. And we're actually undergoing, and it's hard to see it when you're in the midst of it, a very different reformulation of society at a structural level. So there's lots of examples of this, but the boundaries have been dissolving. So a really interesting one that's obviously in the news a lot right now, a boundary that has been dissolving has been between government and business, the private sector, around particularly like the sort of military industrial sort of complex. So as we know, that war has been big business for many years. But what has become more common recently, which is, I suggest, very fascinating and actually kind of worrying, is the level of private, that is businesses, that are basically now become an essential part of the sort of national waging of war, essentially. There were moments in both Afghanistan and Iraq where there were more paid private sector armed individuals on the ground than members of any national military, which is very unusual. Now, there's always been mercenaries, right, throughout history, but the idea that there'd be more of the private sector than of any national sort of military arm is quite remarkable. And it's a new reality, and it has a whole bunch of moral and sort of implications of that. So that's one example. On the other hand, the other examples are different. So social enterprise, very different, is really something that's come about because of the dissolving of the boundary between the private sector and business on one hand, and the civil society and non-profits on the other. So that dissolving of that boundary has created social enterprise. Another thing around that boundary has been new forms of investment. Impact investment. In the UK, we call it social investment. I've spent many years working in that space, helping find new ways of funding social enterprise and non-profits from an investment standpoint, so sort of repayable finance. So that's been a new reality. There's been lots of interest recently in how governments can outsource some of their functions to businesses and charities. In the UK, for example, the largest children's charity, when I left the UK, it had 85% of its income was coming from government contracts, and which was really interesting to me. And one of my questions to them was, at what percentage of that do you actually become part of the government? Like, is it 98%, 99%? And then it's an interesting moral challenge for them, because they also have an advocacy arm, and they like to criticize certain aspects of the government's, approach to, how they understand children and meeting some of the needs of children in current society. But if you're funded primarily by the government, you're also trying to criticize the government. There's this tension there. So these boundaries are dissolving. They're creating lots of new things, new realities in our midst as a society. And all of those realities present to us new moral questions. And some are going to be for good, some will be for not so good, and others are going to be complicated. Into this mix is social enterprise. And social enterprise has undergone some critique in this process. And the reason it's undergone some critique is because none of these boundaries have been dissolving equally. What we've seen in the last 40 years in the US and the UK and Europe particularly, and a little bit in Australia and New Zealand, some other places as well, we've seen the growth of business, the growth of the market. Essentially, the increasing sort of reach of the market into new areas of society and new areas of life. The philosopher Michael Sandel argues that we've gone from having a market economy to being a market society, where everything is basically being able to be bought and sold and traded. And this process of marketization has become a way of kind of how we, it's our default social way of solving problems. So for example, one example is recently in Texas, some of the literacy rates were very low. And so in parts of the state, and so they decided to pay children to read books. And so they had this program where kids would get paid to read. There's been in the prisons in California recently, people that are in jail there can pay to have an upgraded room, right? So you get paid for an upgrade in prison. Recently, it used to be that if you wanted to go sit on a debate in Congress in Washington, DC, that you'd have to stand in a line. And that line would start at a certain time in the morning. You stand and you wait, and if you get in the first few, you get to go watch. Recently, there's been line standing companies that have been started where you pay someone to stand in the line for you, and then at the last minute you switch places with them and you go in. And so all of these different aspects, teaching someone to read, the question of what it means in terms of how you're treated, let's say in jail, and the access to a hearing in Congress. None of those were sort of organized through market activity until very recently, but now they are. Increasingly, there's increasing questions of really interesting ethical questions at the moment around paying for organs, and not the church organs, I'm talking about body organs, very different, and whether that should be allowed or not. There's interesting questions. Obviously, our whole approach to education and healthcare has the market involved in all of that, but it's just increasing its reach. And so some of the critics of social enterprise say, well, isn't social enterprise just part of this process? And isn't this morally challenging for us? Isn't this actually part of the problem of society? So for example, they'd say the kid in Texas who's being taught to read, have they really grasped the joy of reading, or are they just doing it to get the money? And as soon as the money stops, are they going to keep reading or not? What does it mean if somebody's gone to jail and they can pay to be upgraded? Should that matter? Should that really be how rooms in jail and how access to sort of privacy and things like that, should it be just how much money you have? Is that fair? And then the question of also standing in line for Congress. Like, it used to be that there's a basic equality around standing in line. It's just if you get there early, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, it doesn't matter your background, it's like just get there early and you get in. Now, if you're rich, you get in. So of course, lobbyists and the like are the most common uses of that. So the critiques of this process say you're actually changing something. By using the market to now organize something, you're changing its nature. You're changing reading, you're changing jail, and you're changing access to political debate. And you're changing them in ways that can be negative. So some critics say, well, social enterprise, what is going on here? Isn't this just the marketization of poverty? Isn't it just the extension of the market to try and make money from those who have the least amount of access to resources? And so in my sort of academic work, I try and take that question very seriously, because if that's true, we should probably all go do something else, right? Let's be honest. We don't want to be, what keeps me up at night in my sort of academic and professional work is this always this sense of like, oh my goodness, I really hope I'm part of the solution, not part of the problem. But in our complex world, we all have to really ask ourselves those questions all the time. I think with social enterprise, there's actually immense promise. But what we have to do with it, and I think this is where as Christians or theologically, we've got an enormous amount to draw on here. We have to reframe social enterprise outside of our current economic paradigm in society. Because what's really happening with this market growth process that's happening in our culture right now is it's a certain understanding of the market. It's a certain understanding of human behavior that's been primarily influenced by sort of mainstream economics. And in some ways, I think a theological understanding of economics is at the very heart of a renewed sense of a social enterprise and the gift it can be for churches. So I think this work of social enterprise can be profoundly, powerfully aligned with our theology, with our sense of mission and purpose in the world, but it also might not be. So how we frame it, how we talk about it, how we do it, how we think about it, all of those things really seem to matter for me. Because if you think about how often economics is framed in sort of contemporary sort of economic language, individuals are competing with each other for scarce resources, right? That's the basic premise of economics. And because individuals are competing with each other, we can map how they'll behave. We can think about efficiency. We can think about designing sort of market structures to sort of create the best outcomes and so on and so forth. But if you think about the root of economics, as we know, we run this oikos project, is oikonomia, which is the rules of the household. And of course, our congregations is a kind of a house, kind of a home. That if you think about the theological tradition around households and home and economies is very different. We find a very different understanding of the human person from the Genesis story through to the early church and through off into the new creation, where individuals aren't competing. Well, firstly, it's not individuals, it's relationships, it's people, it's human beings in relationships with each other. And that collaboration is our front foot, not competition. That working together is something that is at the root of our behavior. And I suggest in every aspect of our life, not just in terms of when we attend a church, but also when we're serving in our communities, when we're part of organizations, when we're part of our families, and when we're practicing economics. We're not individuals, we're people in relationship with each other that believe that there's enough, right? That fundamentally believe in some abundance in God and in creation. Even when we feel and we acknowledge that there's moments when there's people and families and cultures in the midst of scarcity, that there's a deeper abundance. And the question for us is always, are we willing to share? Are we willing to offer? Are we willing to create systems that are equitable and just in that moment? So what we find is the Christian story presents a very different economic language to our mainstream society story about economics. And I feel that one of our challenges as churches and as leaders is to make sure we're framing our activity not within the current economic landscape. Because whilst, I've written a lot on this in the past, but there's a lot of challenges around that. Because that language isn't neutral. But of course, there's also hope in that as well, because markets can be different, right? And in fact, the economists have often got this wrong. I'd suggest if you think about your own experiences with businesses, working in businesses, thinking about supply chains, thinking about interaction between organizations, that there's enormous amount of behavior in businesses that isn't about selfishness, that isn't about competition, that isn't simply trying to win the whole time, that in fact, people are often generous. They actually care, they listen, they long to be part of something more meaningful and part of something bigger than themselves. And just because the economists have a view of the human person doesn't actually mean it's always accurate and it's always in place. So as Christians, I think we can understand our humanness in a way that is the basis of our economics. And in that way, start enterprises, start organizations that embody and capture the richness of what we believe it means to be human. And I think that question, what does it mean to be human, is the beginning question of this enterprise work, this social enterprise work. And one of the questions that is fascinating in the sort of academic literature around social enterprise is, what does the word social mean? Like, we kind of know the enterprise part of it, and one of the sort of textbook definitions of a social enterprise is it's an organization that generates at least 50% of its income through some sort of trading of goods and services. And the enterprise part is really emphasizes that trading of goods and services, that sort of generation of income through that kind of revenue. But what does the social mean? How does the social change it? Often people say, well, I guess it means people are doing the enterprise for some kind of good in the world, but that good is not defined. And because really in our society right now, who's to define it? Who's to define what good is? I think though as Christians, from our angle, we can actually say, yeah, we've got some sense of that. We've got some sense of what it means what good looks like. And that's why I think social enterprise rooted in churches can speak very strongly to our wider culture around the importance of equity and justice, around the importance of different kinds of relationships, both within these enterprises and produced by these enterprises. And I think it's fascinating for us to explore that and also to point out where that's happening all around us. And that's, to highlight in our communities, in local businesses, where we're seeing different understandings of what it means to be human, to be present. So I think there's a lot of promise for this conversation of social enterprise, and there's big questions about how it's going to play out. Like, is it just going to be the marketization of poverty, where actually wealth is extracted from communities that need it the most, and it goes to investors or it goes to businesses and it leaves? Or is there going to be a different vision, a different model of what sort of long-term economic health looks like for our churches, for our communities, for our organizations? So that is a way that I wanted to sort of frame and sort of bring to the surface some of the kind of deep questions, I guess, that are present in this work. Deep questions about, what the adoption of a new economic model means, right? Because it's not obviously neutral. And it can be profoundly good, profoundly beneficial when it's aligned with your mission and your theology and your values. But also sometimes it can push us and pull us out of shape a little bit. I've worked with many organizations as a consultant over the years who have felt over time that something about their structure as an organization, something about the very way in which they sort of generate revenue and income was pushing and pulling them out of shape a little bit, that they were constantly fighting against dynamics within them. And so my fascinating question in working with these organizations was, well, how do we redesign it so it's more aligned? How do you redesign your economics so it fits more closely who you are and what you're trying to do in the world? So, for example, I'm fascinated by sort of cooperative models and models of sort of shared ownership, where if an enterprise is successful, then everybody involved benefits rather than just the owners, right, or just the founders. I'm fascinated by models which publish on their website the pay differential between the CEO and the lowest paid person. I'm fascinated by models which when they publish their accounts at the end of the year also talk about everything they've achieved in terms of their mission. I'm fascinated by models where that are passionate about local economies, that think that, that look at the research which suggests that if $1 is spent with a local business, that dollar actually ends up being multiplied by 7 or 8 as it transfers through that local community, than if it gets spent with a sort of a national chain, when that dollar only goes around that community 1 time more. It's a differential between 7 and 2. That for me is fascinating. I'm fascinated by how churches, particularly in some of the projects I'm doing right now, can have a social enterprise model to both generate additional income for their congregation, because we absolutely know, and I think this was shared at the very beginning, that the economic model of congregations is in jeopardy right now. And the last 18 months has only sped that process up, and there's a lot of data out there. We're at, I think it's nearly 200 churches a day, I think, closing, and there's lots, or is it might be a week? That's a big difference, isn't it? I'll check that and get back to you. Let's just say it's a lot and it's serious. And a lot of that is this quest for what's a new economic model. And I'm seeing some really encouraging stuff, as I'm sure many of you have, about congregations that are now generating some income through whether it's going down the affordable housing route, whether it's going down, I talked to one the other day that started a brewery, another that's involved in some cafe. We've obviously got the educational models where churches have partnered with schools or started schools and daycare facilities. There's models out there where people have done bike repair shops in their basements, but the point of all these initiatives is how can we best serve and love our neighbors and at the same time generate some income. But how that's done, for me, is the question. It's the feasibility. Can you do it? Can you do it well? And I think lots of us involved in this work are actually seriously got questions about this, like how well can churches do this work? But then the question is not just how well can they do it, but can they do it in ways that really embeds and embodies their theology, where the good that's created is the good that congregation exists sort of do in a world. And I feel like that question is just the thing that really enlivens me. And I'm interested at the moment, we'll talk about this maybe later on, in the processes that organizations and congregations can go through to come up with some sort of feasible, testable experiments around social enterprise. So there's been some great stuff coming through the questions and stuff. So please do, keep using the chat function. And I'd love to hear, some comments and questions from anybody. I'm British, and I love a little bit of pushback and stuff. That's kind of like, for me, it's a bit like a love language. So if you're thinking, oh, this guy's talking rubbish, just let me know that, because you're probably right. But I'd love to hear any comments and questions that anybody has, and we can just, jump into it. That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
So Ken, go ahead. I'll go after Kent.
Okay. Well, I was just going to reinforce what you said about people, even in for-profit businesses, wanting to do something for the greater good, wanting to do something for the common good, and working cooperatively to better other people's lives. It may be that the executives are watching out for the shareholders and to make a profit for the shareholders. But I was a senior director at a large for-profit organization for 20 years, and a Fortune 150 company in the US, and knew a lot of vice presidents and directors who really had a passion to try to improve the quality of life of the people we sold goods to.
Yeah, thanks, Ken. And I feel like one of the reasons that I mean, you mentioned there might be structural reasons, you know, like I think the structure of the kind of limited liability company that's sort of publicly traded is a bit problematic because, you know, the owners and the directors are separate, you know, and so on. But I've also, you know, worked in the private sector and had, you know, experiences where I was really blown away by some of the generosity and culture that can be created in organizations that genuinely exist to do good in the world. What's challenging is we don't often have language to talk about that. And economists don't model that behavior and don't even see it or perceive it as meaningful. And so often if you don't have the language to describe something, you can't pay attention to it. And if you can't pay attention to it, it doesn't grow. It doesn't change, it doesn't develop. So I'm really intrigued about language. And you know, we can talk a bit about it later on, but particularly for me, I feel like the word mutuality is a word that has profound economic implications. And yeah, and I'm intrigued by that. But yeah, I'd love to hear some more thoughts here.
So I would, first of all, I would say that, like Ken, I've been an executive in a Fortune, not a Fortune 150, before Fortune 500. Well, I don't know what General Motors sat, but I've been in that role. And I've worked with, at the time they had a social enterprise. I was with EDS Corporation. They had an EDS Foundation. We've done some things in Atlanta to create opportunities for people with disabilities. Created with the Cerebral Palsy Research Foundation. I led that project. But getting to, I guess, the crux of the matter for me, I would argue that the marketization of poverty already exists, has been at the foundation of the wealth of the Western world, and has continued in that fashion from free labor of enslavement in a free market. And it plays out in impoverished and imprisoned labor. And that's what motivates me to this different economic model, to attempt to make a change and to, in a real sense, to be about the focus on real liberation of people, the same liberation that Jesus Christ talks about in Luke 4:18-19. So that's my comment.
Thanks, Anthony. That's great. And yeah, I think that it's a massive area that needs unpacking in all of this work is, and you know, like for the economist, money is abstract. Wealth is abstract. Like it doesn't have history. It doesn't have people. It doesn't have culture. It's just abstract. And I think one of the important aspects of understanding what's needed to move forward in our communities as Christians is to say that's not true. like right. wealth is from somewhere, and we have to wrestle with where it's come from. It has memory. Wealth is memory, and it has meaning. And unless we identify that and how our own structures, and even in sometimes very specific, like congregations and seminaries and contexts, have benefited from unjust wealth, and that how we then talk about that and respond to that, you know. And obviously the very parallel question is like even how you introduce yourself was beautiful. The question of land, right? For the economist, land is abstract. It's a form of capital. But no, it's not. It's people, right. It's history, it's identity, it's meaning. And our very land also has memory. And so these, for me, these are economic questions. They're not, you know, they're also political, they're also lots of other things, but they're economic, right? Like, and so what concerns me so much is that some of the approach to social enterprise that's going on right now, or at least maybe the impact investment, still has an extractive angle to it. It's still ultimately designed to generate more wealth for very few people who don't live in these communities. Mm-hmm. And so it's that, what is the alternative to that, which intrigues me. But yeah, thank you.
So if I could just push just a little bit more,
Yeah.
One, and I'm intrigued by cooperatives as well. And I think some of the work done by Jorg Rieger, who's a theologian at Vanderbilt, he was my professor at one point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's done some great work around that.
Yeah.
And understanding that from economic base. But then also there is a friend of mine who has 2 PhDs, Christian ethics as well as economics, Michael Green. And Michael Green has written a book entitled A Way Out of No Way, the Economic Prerequisites of the Beloved Community, which focuses on the understandings of that from Martin Luther King and what he was espousing at the time. So I just wanted to add that in there.
That is great. Could you put in the chat that I know, Riga, I don't know about Michael Green work. That sounds phenomenal. I'd love to read that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to open up to any other comments or questions that people have, or spark anything that's sparking in their minds. So I can go for it.
I was gonna say, Mark, so one of the things that I've come across challenging is in this model of pivoting the church, of recognizing the realities that the economic model of the traditional church no longer works, but also finding a passion and a vision, we believe, from God to serve an underserved community and thinking of a social enterprise for that mission. I guess one of the challenges I've run across is in communicating that with different stakeholders, both whether it be board members of the church or whether it be potential funders, mixing the two reasons why in a negative way. I just had somebody share with our board a few weeks ago that, wait a minute, are you doing this for the money? Is that why you're doing this? I don't want to give you any help if you're doing this for the money. When it came up as that part of the reason we started this path was recognizing that our current model of church was going to go out of business in a couple of years. But that's all, so you working with churches, how are they balancing that?
Yeah, so it's not easy. So one of our friends recently created a tool precisely for this reason, to recognize when you're in a room and you're talking with church leaders or people involved in the sort of governance structure of your church, you start talking about money and economic models, and just all this stuff comes up, right? And it comes from different angles, different perspectives, and it's very hard to find a way through that. And so they created this way of, it's almost a tool or a way of actually having conversations. They call it the sort of 4 dimensions or economic dimensions. And they recognize that when we have these conversations in churches right now, that there's 4 dimensions going on. I think one is there's a personal dimension. So there's the challenge of people's own stories around their own sort of economic sort of sustainability of their own families, their own communities, where they came from, how that figures out for them. And then obviously, if you have a pastor in the room, really it's their job that's being talked about. And that you can't, you got to bring that to the table. There's an organizational level, right, which is the economic models. But then there's also a structural level, right, which is what's this bigger economy that we're involved in, which is a lot of what I sort of talked about today. And there's another dimension that I can't remember right now, but I'll look it up. But I'll put that in the chat as well. And that's a useful way of framing trying to frame this conversation and get people's fears and perspectives out on the table. And, you know, and I mean, one of the things I always say if I'm talking about social enterprise to people is like, no one's going to retire off this, right? Like we're creating new economic models to serve people who we're not going after the money. Like, and most social enterprises, the vast majority have mixed income streams, right? Like they'll have some grants or donations, they'll have some, you know, they'll often have a lot of, you know, I call it the hidden cost of doing good. A lot of people involved are putting in extra effort all the time. They're not paid as well as they could be somewhere else. These models don't generate enormous amounts of profit. And one of the reasons is because the people that are more intent on profit have gone by these communities, gone by these needs, because they don't generate that much revenue. Now, every now and again, there will be a couple of models out there that do some amazing good in communities and also generate some really significant returns, but they're the 5%. I'm interested in the 95% where we need to be creative, right? We need to come up with models that work. We need to think about, you know, diversified streams of funding. We need to think about how we get communities and stakeholders involved in creative ways. So there just isn't, you know, like if a church wants to start a cafe, I'm like, do it if it serves your mission, if it helps you create new relationships. The pastor is not going to be able to be paid a salary from the profits of your cafe, right? Like it might help a little bit. It might do some other stuff, you know, and all this stuff. But, you know, the cafe business model is very low margin model, right? Like, you know, whether it's a social enterprise or not, you know, it is, you know, there are some models around housing that potentially have a slightly different structure. But one of my things I always push back is like, no, we're doing this for the sake of the mission first. You know, otherwise, you know, it's not going to work. I find often we want to create a tool at some point at Rooted Good where we help people that are new to this conversation understand more about standard social enterprise economic models, because there's so much misconception about it. Like, and that's why this phrase, the hidden cost of doing good, right, is important, because you're recognizing, you know, there's all sorts of subsidy involved in social enterprise, whether it's, you know, people giving their time for free, having sort of, you know, more patient capital or loans that are, you know, much less interest, or, you know, all the way through. It's like that. But yeah, it's great.
Thanks.
Yeah, is anybody else? We're sort of coming into land a little bit here. I'll just quickly say, because I totally forgot to say this, that my academic work ends up landing in Paul's letter to Galatians, which surprised a few people when I told them that's where it's going to go. Because I think what Paul does in the New Testament, he tries incredibly hard to help these new communities of faith live out and practice a different economy. And it's an economy of what I think at one level can be called an economy of gift and mutuality. And often we've interpreted, you know, the word grace and these letters that Paul writes in very narrow sort of spiritual ways related to doctrines of salvation and so on, which isn't wrong, but they're much bigger words, and they're much all life embracing, all community embracing. And I think there's resources around mutuality, how we can love one another, serve one another. And that to be human for Paul, I believe, is that everyone needs to give and everyone needs to receive, like both. And that for me, that mutuality is always the hallmark for me of when I see something that's transformative, it nearly always has mutuality in it at the core. Like we're all in this together. And I think that's an economic reality, not just, you know, other senses. Now, I'd love to hear, yes, Miriam, love to hear from you if you've got any question or comment to make.
I don't know. I started to think of something, and then you started talking about Galatians, and all I could think of is you foolish Galatians. You know, I always go there when I hear Galatians. But yes, I kind of resonated a little bit with when you said that pastors, you know, that awkward conversation about our salaries. Sometimes you're in the room when they're having this conversation. It's not. It is so disheartening, right? And you're seen as and you're the biggest part of the budget because it's the salary, right? It's like 85% of the budget, pastor's salary, and it's not like you're making huge amounts. I don't know. I got distracted on that and went down some rabbit holes in my mind, but I think part of the issue is. A lot of pastors are also our own enemies in the fact that we don't see what we do as worth a salary or worth doing for pay. And so part of that is reframing a lot of the idea of ministry. Is it a paid? Should it be paid? Is it a paid? I mean, obviously, I'm on the side that yes, I have to make a job, a living. I was also a musician for many years. That's why I said gig economy. You know, that was a whole another thing. But I was a freelance harpist, and you know, I was going to put a value on what I did, based not just on the hours I was working, but everything that came before it, my instrument and practice and so forth. So I just put that out there that a lot of time pastors don't see what they do as worth a salary, or vice versa. Congregations don't see what pastors do as valid enough to put a salary on it. Therefore, this whole conversation of, you know, we could frame it theologically all we want, but if they don't understand that the ministry also needs to be undergirded by a living wage, then it's a problem. So.
Yeah, and I think in some ways that there's been, in lots of different ways, there's been economic sort of, I don't know what to say, if it's injustice or that happens with under the guise of a sense, oh, we're Christians and we should be doing this for free. Or like, you know, like there's been lots of things that's happened in lots of ways to lots of people and communities. And you know, and there's all sorts of dynamics going on. I mean, there are denominations out there that are sitting on an enormous amount of money. There's a seminary I know that has $1 billion endowment. You know, there's all sorts of assets around, but because there's cash problems right now, like, you know, like we're struggling. And so part of it, I think, is that we need new economic models, but also part of it is our structures aren't working. Right. And I think that's really difficult. Like the denominational structures, the kind of structures of education for, you know, pastors, the clergy, where they're coming out with debt, you know, like there's a lot of structural challenges at the same time as small individual challenges. And that's hard, right? Because there's no easy solutions. But it's going to mean the future has to be different to the past. And you know, there's something about the balance sheet which doesn't, like, it's harder to convince ourselves things are working, right? You know, if the balance sheet shows us something, it shows us something, but it's hard for sure. Thank you, Miriam. I think we're coming up to the very end here. I've been told we mustn't go beyond the hour mark. So, and it's Saturday afternoon. Darnell, do you want to, close us out here?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Mark, for sharing, and thank you all for engaging. Mark, it's always a much richer experience when participants engage the presenter. We hope that as you continue to discern this conversation, thinking about your own local church and its social impact, that you will continue to consider MBA as a conversation partner, especially our social entrepreneurship program. You are not alone. Of course, You may be the only one in this room, but there are people who will be watching this video down the road who are part of our tradition and beyond, who are asking the same questions. So keep us in the loop. Let us imagine together, think together, that this work is not done in isolation. So thanks again, Mark, and thank you all. Please join us for our last workshop, exploring social capital, which is important as we engage any endeavor. We're going to need to tap into the people around us who have access, who are our first line of capital. So thank you all, and we'll see you shortly. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Donnell. Thanks all. Bye-bye.